Very much everyone for being here. It's the last day and the last slot of the last moment of the conference. So it is a big effort for all of us to be here. I thank you for your attention and your interest in this topic. I'm going to speak about automatic item generation, and through my presentation I will explain due to the time, in a very brief way what it is, what is one of the most important elements in automatic item generation, and how it can be applied by means, in this presentation, of transforming one item of an INVALSI national test. So, the purpose is this: present an example of transformation of one item of the national test. I will speak about it with much more detail. So what is automatic item generation? It is an emerging science. Now it is called that, but of course, as an emerging science, it is a research field, a very important research field, which has stumbled upon a name in the recent years. The first time that it was called automatic item generation was in 2013. But before that, since the 1950s, people were making a lot of efforts in trying to automatize the way that items are being built by having conceptual elements that, through algorithms using computer technology, they could generate them instantaneously, but the limitation was technology itself. So now, what automatic item generation does is that it fuses cognitive theories from psychology, what you were speaking about a few minutes ago, psychometrics, and computer technology. And this is to expedite and to make more efficient ways of developing assessment instruments. But it requires two basic steps, and I'm oversimplifying the information. The first step is to create what is called an item model, which we can refer to from a reference of what an item specification is. So first we think of an item specification and we're going through the right path. And then the second step is to go through manipulation of specific elements that are embedded in the items itself and that are identified and explicitly in an item model. So, what is an item model? It is very thorough. It's think of an item specification, a classic one, but think of it very specific, very thorough, very deep, grained in all of its elements. This is done because we have to identify them in order to change them, manipulate them, and know what and why we are doing this. So item models are different from item specifications because of this level of detail in the stimulus of the item features, and because of the amount of items they can produce. One item model can produce hundreds or even thousands of specifications depending on how detailed and how finely grained are all of these elements in the item model. I will show you many examples. So they can be developed through two paths or two ways. By using templates or shells, which is not necessarily the most recommended way, but if we identify items, existing items from different tests that have very good psychometric properties, we can use them as molds or shells and take out some of the content and then put in new content that we want to assess. But again, this has the limitation that we usually lose many of these items that we generate. And the other method is through cognitive cognitive design that has 4 main phases. First, we have to develop a cognitive model. Then we have to do or develop the item model itself. Then we have to create software for automatic item generation to work. And then we have to evaluate how the cognitive model is working with the students. The first way of making item models is called weak theory, because not necessarily we have an underlying psychological educational theory behind it. We might have the curriculum. And the second one is strong theory, because we identify exactly what processes, thinking processes, are behind the answers of the students. So we need specific specialists working with us. So the first phase, after we define the latent trait or the ability that we want to assess, we construct, or we have the presence of experts in different fields, in psychometrics, in cognitive psychology, and in test development. We need those minds to work together in order to develop the cognitive map, because they have to identify and define with a lot of detail what are the underlying cognitive processes, thinking processes that the students need to address when they are answering a question. So they also need to explain with detail how the differences between these levels of cognitive abilities are directly related to levels of difficulty, empirical difficulty with the items. So we state a priori how with one single item model we can have different levels of difficulty with the items when we change its elements. I will give you some examples. And then we could also do an analysis of the existing items, but again, this is not the most recommended way, but it is done from many institutions do it. And after this work of this specialized committee, we have as a product a curricular genealogy map, which does that. It is a map that identifies the relations between these cognitive abilities. It has, in a visual way, what is the item origin? Does it come from a curriculum? Does it come from, for instance, the INVALSI tests come from the national indications and guidelines, and they have specified national goals. So that could be one of the identified elements in the cognitive genealogy map. So then the second phase, we have to decide what type of item do we want. Do we want a multiple choice? Do we want matching and completion? Do we want an open-ended? First, we do that. And then we identify the item stimulus features that we are going to change and manipulate. And these are 3 types. They are called the incidentals, the radicals, and we have the functional constraints. So the incidentals do not change the content. They do not change the construct. They are mostly semantic. The radicals are the content itself. So this might change the level of difficulty if that is the purpose, or we can maintain the level of difficulty, but we change the content itself. And the functional constraints have to do with controlling the non-construct interfering variants. So we have to set rules. We cannot do that, do this or that with the item, because we will go away from the construct that is being measured. And the third phase is when we create the software. By now, since the early 2000s, there are only 5 well-known softwares that exist for automatic item generation that are functioning. They are not open source, not yet. Yes, unfortunately, and they are expensive. There is the mathematics test creation assistant, the item generator, the Igor, the Generex, which is from my country, Mexico, and the enhanced automatic question creator. So these are private firms, and they own the software rights, but it is not difficult. What you need is a very good programmer, and to know how to communicate what you want to the programmer. So the last phase is after you have everything, the maps, everything identified, what you're going to do, the rules, all of the elements that you want to interchange, then you evaluate the model itself, the cognitive model, and how it performs psychometrically. Through history, this was supposed to be avoided, but evidence has shown that it is much better to do field trials of the item models and some samples of the items that are produced by the item models. So there are many ways of obtaining validity, but one of the very positive ways of doing this is, and gathering very good evidence, is cognitive laboratories, where we interview the students, or we track their eye movements or their mouse movements, and we have a lot of information with that of how the items are performing. So there are different input sources to make a genealogy map. One of the elements that you have here in INVALSI is a specification that includes a characteristic site of the item, where it comes from, and what it assesses. So you have this information, which is very good. What is needed is to develop it a little bit further. You will see why. Other inputs of information are, for instance, when we have identified the response processes and the basic skills that are needed to solve one of the items with one specific context, like this list. And the cognitive model, this example, I will not take credit for this example. It is a complex thing to build, but this is the end product where this is an adaptation of a model done with national data from Mexico. And this is with a very similar item of the INVALSI test that assesses the use of decimal numbers, fractions, and percentages to describe everyday situations. So we have on the top two layers, the abilities and the processes, the cognitive processes that are needed and how they are related to answer a question. And in the bottom, we have three categories: the cognitive components, the metacognitive components, and if we want, we can embed in the model the affective components and how they relate to the cognitive and metacognitive components. So this information is very useful for educators. So now an example with an INVALSI 5th grade primary school math item. So how would it look like, right? So we have item D13, which I like very much because I love ricotta. And I chose it because it is a simple item. It is now it is a multiple choice item, but we will see how it can be transformed into an automatic item generation item that yields for 1 and 2 and 3 and more items. For instance, we have, remember those terms that the elements that we have to identify? These do not, for instance, this one in green, do not affect at all the psychometric properties, but we can change them. We can change them for different foods, for different persons, because here we have the grandfather, yes. And we have ingredients, so we can change them. So these are the incidentals, remember? Okay, so now, these elements are the ones that are going to change the difficulty level and are directly related to the construct, okay? So these are the fractions and the proportion, the quantity. So these are called the radicals. What if we do this? The first step is to change it, instead of a multiple choice item, an open-ended question. This changes completely the level of difficulty for the student, because they have to rely only on memory and knowledge. Okay. Second, we changed the radicals. So we identify the fractions and the quantities that are going to be directly related to the construct. So once and again, we can change the radicals, as you just saw. Okay, and then we can also change the incidentals. Instead of ricotta, we had chocolate truffles. Instead of sugar and cream, we have, what is this? Butter and melted chocolate. Instead of the nono, we have the mother. See? So these elements do not affect the construct, but they change the item. And if we combine the changing of the radicals with the incidentals, then we can have many different items of different foods, with different ingredients, with different fractions, but we have to be very careful that they make sense, that they still are measuring the level of proficiency that the students are supposed to know, and not higher or lower, right? So it does take a lot of detail in the work. So I think you would now get the idea of how we can simplify automatic item generation, but we can make open-ended questions, we can interchange elements, we can use computer technology to switch, to use a mouse, to color an area, to whatever technology allows us to do. So the item model development, it is a complex task. It is not easy to choose all of the elements that we need, because for instance, with this example, with the fractions, we need a lot of fractions and a combination of fractions that can give us natural numbers, proportions that make sense and that do not have decimals, like in this example. So we have to be very careful with those details. So that means that the item model developers have to be very well trained, have to be very knowledgeable in their field, math, languages, science, English, whatever we are measuring. So they have to be very good at this. And we have to be very precise, very detailed. It takes time, but once we have the item model, we have a lot of power to combine the elements and to have many, even hundreds of versions of the test through one single process. But we have to be very careful with radicals, particularly, and the functional constraints, these rules and these restrictions. And this automatic item generation, it is very cost effective, but after a while, for instance, it is not cost effective in low scale settings. In national tests like the ones from INVALSI, it is very good. It is very powerful, and it relieves a lot of the stress and anxiety of having to build more and more and more items each year or each 2 years, because they tend to die after a while. Children memorize them, or they tell them to the other generation, so they get used to them and they wear off. And well, we have high quality items if we control the quality of the process. And why do we go through so much trouble of the cognitive maps, of the specialists, and of all these detail of the curriculum map? Because the cognitive design for automatic item generation has the potential to identify what cognitive processes our students master, but most importantly for educators, in which one they have difficulties. If we know this, we have a lot of power as policymakers, decision makers, educators, to build educational programs for teachers, educational materials to help the students, programs to guide the students and to tutor them in order to strengthen their abilities. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.